In 2009, Marcus Notch Persons began developing video games poster child Minecraft. Being experienced in game development, Notch's early Minecraft prototypes nailed the fun and the game gained massive popularity. So in 2010, he expanded his team, adding Carl Manna and Jacob Porser to manage the game's growth, and only 1 year later, sales skyrocketed to 1 million copies. But after a few years of crazy success, Notch made a fairly controversial decision. He sold Minecraft to Microsoft for $2.5 billion.
Microsoft has bought Minecraft creators Mojang for a cool $2.5 billion.
According to Notch, he sold Minecraft because he felt overwhelmed by the pressure and the criticism that came with the game's success, stating in a tweet, "I'm not a CEO. I'm a nerdy computer programmer who likes to have opinions on Twitter." Now, as part of the acquisition, Notch left Mojang, giving Microsoft full reign over the game's development and future updates. So only 5 years after the release of Minecraft, Carl and Jacob walked away with $750 million, and Notch walked away with $1.75 billion, the most amount of money ever made by an indie developer. And it was all thanks to something called equity.
What the hell is even that?
Now, equity is the most valuable asset in the world. Some may say it's gold, some now say it's data, but it's not those. Trillions are made and lost every year thanks to equity. Some of you may know the word equity and its meaning, some of you may not. You may know it instead as ownership or stocks or shares. It has all sorts of names, but whatever you want to call it, equity is not only the most valuable asset in the world, it is the most valuable asset you personally can have as an owner of a game studio. Yet equity is one of the least understood topics in the world of gaming. Most people don't know what it is or why it matters. Most people also don't know there are different types of equity or even how to set it up correctly. I want to change that. I'm going to cover everything I think is important for you to know about equity, and like the previous legal video, I will be talking with my good friend Dan, the lawyer. He has helped thousands of companies, including indie developers, with equity distribution, and he's a partner of ours with the Going Indie Game Kit, where we do provide equity docs. It's important to note that equity can be seen as a deeper topic, but as you can see, it's vital you pay attention to everything we discuss. So do your best, write some notes, and let's get into it.
Okay, equity. What is it? Take us away.
So this is often the second thing that you need to figure out or that you need to document in your business after you've got the legal formation, back from the state. You've got that all figured out. Your organizational documents are all hammered down. Equity represents the ownership of your company. So if you have any distribution that you want to send out to stockholders or to members, the equity represents what percentage of that are you entitled to. Or if you sell the company, your equity represents your ownership of the proceeds of the sale of the company. So that's the equity of a company. Often, when you hear stock or stockholders, that's referring to equity. If you hear membership interest in an LLC, that's referring to equity. It's just the ownership percentage that entitles you to the economic value of the company.
So real quick, the reason why Notch made more money than his other team members when he sold Minecraft was because he owned 71% of the company Mojang, or had 71% of the equity in Mojang, where Jacob owned 15% and Carl owned 14%. This is known as the economic value of equity. How many shares or stock you own correlates to how much you will receive upon a company's sale. So if a company is worth $1 billion and you own 25%, your share is worth $250 million, relatively. Which, by the way, is why people sell their companies. If you truly want to understand why so many indie devs willingly sell their studios to big corporations, it's because they want their buyout. They want their money. And the only way to do that is to, number one, sell your company to somebody bigger or somebody else, another company. Or number two, an initial public offering, or IPO, which just is the professional way to say to sell your company to the public. So no matter how you phrase it, you need to sell your company to get the monetary value from your equity. That's why all investors will push companies towards an acquisition. It's how investors get their money back. There is a third way to get value from your equity, and that is borrowing against your asset holdings, also known as asset-based borrowing, something Elon Musk and many other wealthy people are known for doing. But for most of you, that isn't something you should consider and is something I'm not really going to discuss. Great. So we covered the economic value of equity. But what you need to know as well is that there are different types of equity with different economic rights. Dan explains it this way.
There's a few things that you should keep in mind. So there's typically your base class of equity is what in a corporation we call common stock. In an LLC, it's often just called the common units or the basic membership interest. I like to try and align the language between corporations and LLCs if possible, and so I would call it common stock or common units for a corporation or an LLC. What that represents, and that's typically what a founder, the original owners, will get, that represents the economic rights that are left over after you've paid off all of your creditors and any preferred equity. We'll talk about preferred equity in a little bit. But basically, if you sell the company for a lot of money, or you're making a lot of money year over year, and you don't have any debts to pay off, and you don't have any investors with a preference, then you have all of that upside. So the common equity has most of the upside in a company in terms of the economic value. That said, if your company doesn't do well and you go to sell it and you're not able to get a whole lot, the common equity doesn't have a lot of downside protection, meaning they get paid last. The creditors, the debt, and any preferred equity holders like investors will get paid before you. So you don't have any downside protection, but you have all of the upside. So that's what typically founders will hold, common equity. Investors who come in will get what we call preferred equity, preferred stock. They get basically that preference that I was talking about just a little bit ago. If you go sell the company, they will get paid before the common equity does. So if there's a limited amount of money to go around, investors will get paid first. They'll get their money back and maybe even a percentage guaranteed return, depending on how you set that up. But they'll get paid before the common equity gets anything.
And so this is often why when you see publisher deals or you see any of these investor deals where they'll get all this money long before the game developer, right? Long before the studio. Predominantly, it's because of either contracts or what Dan just outlined.
Exactly. So they have a preference above what the common stockholders have. So those are your two primary classes of equity that you're going to be dealing with. And, most founders, like I said, you don't need to worry about preferred equity until you're raising money from an investor or a distributor or somebody who is asking for a preference in that case. There's also, so we've talked about the economic rights associated with equity. Equity is usually also tied to certain governance rights. And so when you have a stockholder vote, that stockholder vote is typically based on how many votes per share somebody has. Now stockholders don't necessarily control the company. There are just certain actions that require a stockholder vote.
So what Dan is saying is that there is more to equity than just monetary value. With equity comes voting rights, rights to vote on certain things within the company. This is important to know if you want to retain control over your studio. Dan will explain how you can set up equity so that founders have more voting control.
You can set up your equity so that founders might have more voting control. And so voting control and economic rights don't have to be aligned entirely one-to-one. You might have a share of a class of stock, we can call it founder's stock, that has 10 votes per share or 100 votes per share to make sure that the founders have more voting control. But then when you go to sell the company, distributions are made based on the share, not on the votes. And so you might have more economic or more governance control, but less economic rights. And so you can when you're dealing with equity, you want to be thinking about that because you can set that up in specific ways to protect yourselves as the founders, to make sure that you hold more governance rights while still being able to give up some of that economic upside to team members or to investors or to partners.
It's the Mark Zuckerberg example, right?
Exactly.
He has, I can't remember if it was 10, I think it's 10 to 1 or something along those lines. So even though he's a minority shareholder now on Facebook or Meta, he still has majority control based off of the number of voting shares.
Exactly. So that's equity. It has economic and governance rights.
All right. So simply put, there are two types of equity, common and preferred, and there are two types of benefits to equity, economic and governance, which just means voting. For the majority of you, it probably doesn't matter to know a lot about preferred equity unless you raise money or get a publisher. But for anyone that isn't a solo dev, you should understand the economic and governance rights, because when you bring on team members, bring on other people, these things matter. And I'll explain with my own story. When I started my very first company years and years ago, there was a few founders, two buddies and myself. We were like brothers, talking every day and hanging out at night. We were young and we were dumb, so we didn't talk about who owns what. Each of us just believed and trusted in one another. But as the company became more legit and we got some money, one founder didn't want to continue. He didn't want to commit to the slog of building a software business. However, he felt his contribution still deserved ownership in this early fledgling company. Tons of arguments ensued, and sadly, this other founder and I are no longer friends. All because we didn't set parameters and establish equity correctly. Years later, we call each other now and again, so things are better, but they're not the same. Had we talked about ownership, had we had that equity discussion from the beginning and used the right documents, we most likely would still be friends. Sounds somewhat cliche, but it is true. I have all sorts of stories of friends fighting friends, brothers fighting brothers, even dads fighting their kids over who owns what in a company. Money makes people do odd things, which is why I'm adamant about establishing equity correctly. If done right, you should retain friendships and family ties. If done right, equity will help you grow when you have no money. Not to mention, equity will help you establish clear roles in the business and create incentives for other people in the company, people who are not founders. There's a reason 76% of NVIDIA employees are now millionaires, with 1 in 3 boasting a net worth of over $20 million. Why? Well, not because of salaries, but because NVIDIA employees get equity. So for this last point, I want to cover how to divvy out equity correctly with other founders in your studio and how to divvy out equity to employees.
The last thing I'll talk about with equity is economic incentive to team members, what we often call equity incentive plans. So if you are hiring team members and you want to give them a stake in the success of your game and of your business, you can give them these equity incentive awards. Now, if you're a corporation, like I talked about, that's very easy. You can do stock options. Very simple to issue stock options, very common. It's a process and a structure that is understood by many people, and the taxes are very clear on what happens there. If you're an LLC, stock options aren't always an option, and so there you have to get a little bit more creative, and you look at other things, maybe profits, interests, phantom equity, things like that. But that's something that you want to think about, is how do I incentivize team members with equity awards? Usually those equity awards are based on, similar to stock, some shares that they receive, and it's usually tied to a common stock equity right. And so the economic rights, share for share, are pretty much the same as the common stock equity rights. And you can change governance rights, things like that. But that is something that you want to think about for incentivizing team members with equity.
Great stuff. So there are different types of equity incentive plans based off the type of business you have, and they will also differ if you are giving equity to co-founders or employees. But how should you distribute equity? Are vesting schedules still the best practice?
So vesting schedule is where somebody who you've granted equity to will vest into the ownership of that equity over time, meaning if they leave your company, they don't walk away with that full block of equity that you granted them. They only walk away with what they've vested through the time that they leave the company during that vesting schedule. A typical vesting schedule that we use in the industry is a 4-year vesting schedule, where it won't start vesting until the end of year 1. That gives you some kind of getting to know you period, to understand if they're a good fit, if they're a good worker, if they're, intelligent enough to provide the value that you want them to provide. And then once they've passed that year mark, they vest into the equity, month over month. So that's a common vesting schedule.
What's the best way to determine equity when you have a new partner? You guys don't know how serious this is. There's 3, 4, 5 of you. How do you figure this out? And how do you make sure that it's fair across the 4 years that you're vesting?
That is a great question. And it's honestly one of the hardest questions to answer because it entirely depends on who brings what value to the table, who's going to be working full time, who's going to be getting paid what, because sometimes some founders, defer their salary. Other founders are required to get paid more. So all this kind of goes into a big black box that somebody's got to pull, names and numbers out of to assign who owns what. Typically, the easiest thing is to have one key founder that is, talks to all of those other co-founders and says, hey, this is what we're going to do. That said, there are different methodologies out there that, you can look up and say, hey, how do we do this? How do we assign value? How do we assign ownership? One of the common ones is called slicing pie. You assign value to what somebody brings, whether it's a value to their time, a value to the IP that they're creating. If they're putting money in, you assign different values. And then at the end of some, baking period where that pie gets baked, you figure out who owns what slice of the economic pie. And then, that's how you've determined the ownership, because you determine who puts in how much time and effort during that baking period. So that is, there's different methodologies out there, but it's tricky. There's not one size fits all. There's nuance to every discussion and every application to try and come up with a fair shake. Inevitably, somebody usually is going to feel like, oh, I'm undervalued. This wasn't fair. And those lead to additional conversations in 1 year's time, 2 years' time, where they want to reevaluate that position. And you have to look at it and say, okay, yeah, you've earned more. Or, you got a big chunk to start out with and you're not pulling your weight. We probably need to let you go because we need to free up the equity that you've got because you're not adding enough value to justify that. So it's tricky, and it's something that you have to reevaluate every year. How have we distributed equity, and are we getting good usage out of that equity? The worst thing that you can have as a founder is what we call dead equity on your equity table, your capitalization table. Equity that is not driving value by incentivizing somebody to work hard. If you have somebody who owns a chunk of your company and they've left and they're not providing value, that is dead equity, it's dead weight, and that's a valuable resource that you've wasted, because equity should be incentivizing somebody to work hard. That's what you want your equity to be doing.
Yeah. And so my only piece I would add to all this, have that conversation early and often. I have only ever seen this becoming a prominent issue when you're not having open and honest conversations. And usually when you aren't having these conversations, like Dan said, somebody's going to feel gypped. Somebody's going to feel like something's unfair, and they're not going to be doing the work that they should be until they feel like it's fair. So it's vital that you have this conversation the moment you start having any kind of partnership, any kind of conversation with other founders. And it's a mistake I've made in companies that I've started where I've lost some of my best friends, just due to these kind of mistakes. So definitely do it from the beginning, do it consistently, and do it often.
Again, thanks, Dan, for chatting with me and helping game developers navigate the crazy world of legalese. If you guys need help setting up equity docs, we got you covered with the Going Indie Game Kit. Once you've set up your entity, we can help you issue equity within our partner platform. We can make sure you have all the right docs, everything taken care of. But I would only suggest taking this step when you are good and ready. Don't rush into incorporation or into setting up equity docs. These things cost money. So when the time comes and you are ready, take that step and make sure you do it right. The largest tech acquisition in history was a video game company. So there is legitimate value in your studio's equity, in understanding what is equity and how to distribute it, and making sure it's all done correctly, especially if you want to avoid losing a friend like I did. But again, the majority of you aren't at this stage yet and should still be looking to improve your skills and development, not establishing equity. And if that's you, then you should go check out Brilliant. They are the sponsor of today's video. They are a partner of mine on both my Going Indie channel and here. They are a legit company that can truly help you learn how to code better. I've been using Brilliant now for a few months, and it's actually a great service. Don't think I'm just saying this because they're paying me. For those that don't know what Brilliant is, it looks like this, and the platform is centered around STEM topics, which is perfect for any aspiring game developers. What's even more amazing is that every lesson has you learning from the ground up. They're filled with hands-on problem solving. Brilliant chose this method because it's proven to be 6 times more effective than just watching lecture videos. Plus, all the content on Brilliant was crafted by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, Google, and more. Learning doesn't take much. Just 20 minutes every day can help you start moving the needle towards becoming a game developer. Just replace that scrolling you do when you're on the can with Brilliant. It's that easy. The best part, you can try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Click on the link below in the description or scan the QR code on screen. You also get 20% off an annual premium subscription if you use my code. Thanks again, Brilliant, for sponsoring us, and good luck on your game, guys. We'll see ya.